What can superheroes teach us about being human? That's the question that's posed in this book, The Psychology of Superheroes. And it's a question that I want to explore with you today, but I also want to bring in some theology. What can we learn from this about what it means for God to be God? So let's discuss that now. The chapter that I want to discuss with you is on mind-reading superheroes. It's by Professor William Ickes, and Ickes does a lot of research on the brain. And he talks about mind-reading superheroes, and probably the most popular one is Professor X from the X-Men. What Ickes does is asks the question, well, we can see this in the superhero world, but does mind-reading like Professor X actually happen in the real world? And sometimes people have a sense that they're able to read other people's minds, but Ickes says that the studies show that we don't have scientific evidence that people can read one another's minds the way that superheroes like Professor X can read other people's minds. So what's actually happening here if it's not a superhero power? How do we have this ability to understand what other people are thinking and feeling? Well, Professor Ickes says that this is what he calls everyday mind reading. And there are two ways in which we can infer what other people are thinking or feeling. We can do this consciously, but we can also do this unconsciously. And it's important to understand that when we do this consciously or unconsciously, the average person, even if they've grown up as twins with another or have been married to the same person for 50, 60 years, is only accurate 30% of the time. So, in other words, you don't know a thing about me. So what are these conscious and unconscious ways that we can infer what other people are thinking and feeling? Well, one way is, conscious way, is to seek to understand and to listen to what the other person is actually saying. You try to understand their worldview, their social constructs, how their interpretive frame. And then the other way that we can do this consciously is to try to understand body language. Is the person smiling? Is the person frowning? Is the person sitting like this? Or is the person open like this? So those are the conscious ways we can try to interpret or infer what other people are thinking or feeling. More interesting to me is the unconscious ways in which we do this. Ickes says that the mind works unconsciously, and we're not in control of how we're feeling or what we're always thinking. And the reason that we're not in control is for three reasons that he gives. First, emotional contagion. So when you're with a group of people and they're happy, you tend to be happy and you mimic what's going on in other people around you. But if people are angry or sad, that can also infect, and we begin to take on the feelings of others. This is part of the way that the brain works. Another unconscious way is through physiological contagion as well. So you begin to breathe at the same pace as the people that you're physically close to. Your heart rate begins to mimic other people's heart rate. Also, women have similar menstrual cycles when they live close to one another. That's the second way. The third way, and probably the most fascinating, fundamental way, is through mirror neurons. And this was discovered in the early 1990s. And what's happening with our brains is that when we make an action towards something, mirror neurons in our brains will go off. But the interesting thing is that when we see somebody else making an action, the same mirror neurons will go off as well. And it's as if our brain is telling us that we have done the action that the other person has done. So our brain is mimicking what's going on around us. And the fascinating thing is not only is our brain telling us that we're making these actions without us actually making them, but it's also unconsciously inferring what those actions mean. Let me give you an example of how this works. This morning, my wife was putting the boys in the car, and strapping them into their car seats. And I came in a few seconds later to try to help her. She was there buckling in our youngest son and was having some issues. And I was just standing there, and she looked at me and she said what I thought was a rather short, frustrated way of saying, "Do you want to buckle him in?" And I said, "Well, yes." And so then she got in the front seat and I buckled our son in. And I would normally have let this go and then gotten upset throughout the rest of the day. But I asked her, "Well, it seemed like you were frustrated with me. Why were you so frustrated? I was just here wanting to help." And she said, "Well, I'm not frustrated with you. I was just asking if you would like to help buckle him in." And I said, "Oh, okay." So in other words, my wife was saying, "You don't know a thing about me." So I know something about my wife, but I only know 30% of what she's thinking at any given time, which means that I could be very wrong. But the thing is that these interpretations that we have of one another happen unconsciously. We don't know that we are interpreting in this way. It just happens. Now, what does this have to do with God? Well, it's fascinating because at the end of Jesus' life, when he's on the cross, he has this really interesting thing that he says, which is this: "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And here we see the anthropological truth that we're getting at here, which is we're unconscious of many of the mechanisms that are going on in our brains. We don't know exactly how other people are influencing us through emotional contagion, through physiological contagion, and through mirror neurons. How we get caught up in these cycles of anger and rage and violence that are bigger than us, and we get swept up in them. But Jesus is saying here on the cross, there's another thing that you can get swept up into, and that is my way of life, which is based on God's forgiveness. So we see here that God offers forgiveness to our violence and invites us to participate in that forgiveness, live in the spirit of forgiveness. So even when we are unconsciously inferring from others that they are angry or upset, we can consciously take a step back and say, maybe my interpretation of that is wrong, and seek to live into not in anger back towards that person, but into a spirit of forgiveness. So those are my thoughts. I'd like to hear what you think. Thank you. Bye.